Somewhere tonight, a lantern is burning for you. I did not come to Castle Rock for the ball. I came because a mapmaker follows rivers, and the river here bends strangely, north instead of east, as if something old still shapes the land beneath it. But a man traveling alone is a man who gets invited to things, and so I found myself seated at the edge of a hall I had no business being in, a cup of something too sweet in my hand, my satchel resting against the leg of my chair, where I could feel it without looking. The room was gold and warm. Candlelight pooled on marble that had been laid, I guessed, within my own lifetime, over ground that was not new at all. I could feel that, the way you feel a scar under new skin. Music drifted somewhere above the talk, strings and something with a low, patient rhythm, like a heartbeat slowed down for company. Through the tall windows behind the dancers, the hill fell away into dark, and past that dark, faint under the moon, I could see a shape on the far reach, a tower. Broken at the top, ivy climbing it like it was trying to hold the stone together out of kindness. Around its base, even at this distance, I thought I could see pale colour moving in the wind. Wildflowers growing wild across what must have once been open ground. I asked the woman beside me, mostly to have something to say, who the tower had belonged to. I did not finish the question. The room did not stop. Not really. The dancers kept dancing. The strings kept playing. But the air near me changed, the way air changes before rain. And an old woman I had not noticed sitting 2 seats down rose, crossed the space between us without asking, and sat in the empty chair at my side, as if it had been kept for her all evening. She had the hands of someone who had scrubbed a great many floors in her life. Surprised by anything a long time ago. "You don't ask about him," she said, before I could apologize for whatever I'd done. "You listen, if he lets you." I asked carefully who he was. "The Knight," she said, and something in the way she said it told me the title was doing the work of a name she wasn't ready to use. I asked if he still lived here. She looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that measures whether a stranger deserves the truth or only the story people tell instead of it. "He does," she said. "Everyone here will tell you that. Present tense, as if he might walk through that door tonight." She glanced toward the window, toward the tower on the ridge, and I saw something cross her face that I would spend the next hour understanding. No one has seen him in longer than I can count, and still, present tense. I did not know then what she meant. I know it too well now. She folded her hands in her lap, the way you settle in for something long, and the candlelight caught the lines in her knuckles, and somewhere behind us a servant refilled a cup that no one had asked for, and the music kept playing as if nothing in the room had shifted at all. "I was a servant here," she said. "Back then, I only ever brought what was asked. I did not understand that sentence either. Not yet. But she said it like a woman setting down the first stone of a bridge she meant to walk all the way across, whatever waited on the other side. And so I stayed seated, my cup forgotten, my satchel warm against my leg, and I let her begin. You have to understand what he was, Mirelle said, before you understand what he did. He was the finest sword the kingdom had produced in 2 generations, she told me. Not cruel with it, not proud, which made the talent stranger somehow, like a gift he'd been given by mistake and decided to be careful with. He'd come up from nothing, a stable-hand son who'd caught the eye of a training master, and by the time he was grown, he could outfence any 3 men the court could send at him at once, and did once at a tournament, laughing the whole time like it embarrassed him more than it impressed anyone else. And he loved the princess. Not in the way court poets write it, not as a game or a performance. Mirelle said it plainly, the way you'd state a fact about weather. He loved her the way a man loves the one true fixed point in an otherwise moving world. Her name was Elowen. I remember that Mirelle's voice changed slightly when she said it, softened at the edges, the way you say a name you haven't spoken aloud in years and find you still know exactly how it feels in your mouth. The 2 of them had grown up half a hallway apart, she said. A knight's household abutted the royal wing in those days, before the wars pushed the family in tighter, and so their childhoods had braided together without anyone deciding it should happen. By the time either of them understood what they felt, everyone around them already knew. There was talk, Mirelle said, of a match. Not proper, not by rank, but the old queen liked him, and love that visible is hard for a court to argue against forever. She paused, and in that pause I heard the ambient hum of the ballroom fall away, just for a breath, replaced by something colder in her voice. And then, one autumn, she fell ill. Nothing dramatic at first, a tiredness that didn't lift, a cough that came and went and came back worse. The healers were called and called again, and each time they left with less certainty in their faces than they'd arrived with. And the night, Mirelle said, vanished. I asked her what she meant. Gone, she said. No campaign called him. No border needed defending that season. I checked the old ledgers myself, years later, out of a need I couldn't explain to anyone. He simply wasn't in the castle anymore. The same week, she took to her bed. Everyone assumed he'd ridden for some healer in the mountains, some old cure only the far villages remembered. No one asked too hard. You didn't, back then, ask a grieving man where he'd gone. She was quiet a moment, and I noticed, for the first time, the particular chill coming off the tall windows behind us. Real cold, not imagined, a draft that shouldn't have reached this deep into a warm room, carrying with it, faint as a memory, the smell of something burnt. Old smoke, the kind that gets into stone and never quite leaves. He came back 3 weeks later, she said. Thinner,
different in the eyes. And he was carrying something he would not set down. Not for meals, not for sleep that anyone saw. A basket, covered, held against his chest like it weighed more than it looked. She let that sink. Somewhere above us, near the high windows, a curtain moved, though no one had opened anything, and a single candle on our table guttered sideways and steadied.
That, Morel said, is where I truly begin. The princess did not recover, Morel told me. Not the way anyone hoped. Word moved through the castle the way it always does, servant to servant, faster than any official announcement. And what moved was this. The princess had died in the night, 3 weeks after the knight's return, quietly, in her sleep, with only her nurse present.
There was no body laid out for viewing, which struck some as strange, and struck others as simply the family's private grief, and no one pressed the question of why, because in a castle, some silences are load-bearing. You learn not to lean on them. Mirelle had been 15 that year, knew enough to service that she was given the smaller, unwanted tasks, and one of hers, in the weeks before, had been running errands for the knight directly.
At his own quiet request, bypassing the usual channels. He asked for strange things, she said. Herbs I didn't recognize, that I had to seek out from a woman 2 villages over who dealt in things the castle apothecary wouldn't stock. A jar sealed with wax that he told me never to open, only to carry. Salt, more than any wound needed. A length of red thread. She held up her own hand, turned it over as if checking it for something. I told myself it was medicine. That's what you tell yourself when a person you trust asks you to fetch things you don't understand and to say nothing about it. I only ever brought what was asked. I asked her gently if she knew what any of it was for. Not then, she said. God help me, not for years. It was around this time, she said, that the first warden came to Castle Rock. Not for anything to do with the princess, not that anyone understood. Wardens travelled the region on rotation, hunting older business, forbidden trades in bone and binding that the crown had outlawed generations back and never stopped chasing. This one arrived on some unrelated inquiry, a smuggler's route through the valley below, nothing to do with grief or sick rooms. But Mirelle remembered him precisely, the way conversation dimmed a half step when he crossed a room. Not from fear, exactly, more the way birds go quiet before weather changes. The cold brass smell that clung to his coat, some oil the order used to keep their sigils from tarnishing. The way his eyes moved across a room, cataloguing rather than simply looking. He didn't so much as glance at the knight that first visit, Mirelle said. Why would he? There was nothing to see. Grief is all anyone would have shown him. A man carrying a covered basket. A man carrying a covered basket he wouldn't set down, walking the halls at strange hours, refusing every offer of comfort. Nothing a warden hunts for. She reached out then and touched the edge of my cup, an old habit maybe, a servant's reflex to tend to things even at rest.
But I remember thinking, she said, even at 15, before I understood anything, that the night watched him leave the way you watch a fire you've just managed to smother. Relief, and the certainty it isn't finished yet. Here is where the cat enters the story, though of course by then she had already been living in it a while. Morel told me the knight kept an animal after Elowin's death, a white cat, unusually calm, that he carried the way other men carried grief itself, close to the chest, one hand always resting on it. Even when he sat, even when he stood at the window for hours, looking at nothing anyone else could see. People found it strange, Morel admitted. A man of his standing mourning a princess and taking such tender comfort in a stray cat instead of the company his rank entitled him to. There was talk. Some thought it madness brought on by grief. Some thought it beneath him. No one thought to ask why he refused to let anyone else so much as touch it.
He would not attend the funeral rites, she told me, when the family finally held them, weeks late, quiet and small, more obligation than mourning. He stood at the back of the chapel with the cat in his arms and did not approach the empty bier, and left before the final words were spoken, and no one dared say anything to him about it, because grief, everyone agreed, does strange things to a man. I was sent to his chambers once that season, Morel said, to bring linens.
He wasn't meant to be there. I thought the hour was safe. He was seated by the window with the cat in his lap, and he was speaking to it. Not the way a man speaks to a pet. The way you speak to someone who might actually answer. I asked what he'd said. I only caught the end of it, she told me. He said a name.
Not the cat's, if it had one. Hers. A private name. A childhood name. The kind two people invent between themselves and never share with anyone else. I knew it because I'd heard it once before, years earlier, through a door I shouldn't have been listening at, when they were both still young enough that love was a game they thought no one saw. She paused, and in that pause the ambient hum of distant music seemed to thin further, and I became aware, with the particular clarity a story sometimes grants you, of the smell in the room. Beneath the candle wax and the crushed flowers someone had set on our table, something faint and wrong. Smoke. The barest ghost of it, riding the same cold draft that kept finding us from those high windows. The cat's ears turned toward that name, Morel said, the way an animal's do at any sound. That is all I saw. That is all it was, I told myself. An animal turning toward a voice it knew.
She looked at me then, and something in her face made clear she no longer entirely believed what she had just said, and perhaps never had. It was not long after this, she told me, that a warden returned to Castle Rock. A different matter, officially, some loose thread from the smuggling inquiry the previous man had left behind. But this time, in passing, almost as an afterthought during questioning meant for someone else entirely, Morel was asked what she remembered of the princess's final illness. Nothing pointed, nothing accusing. Routine.
The kind of question a thorough investigator asks a dozen servants without suspecting any of them.
I don't know why I lied, Mirelle said. I hadn't decided to. It simply came out of me, smooth as truth, that I remembered nothing unusual at all. I have wondered since whether some part of me already knew there was something worth protecting, long before I understood what it was. Years passed, the way they do in a story someone else is telling you, folding themselves down into a handful of sentences that took a lifetime.
The knight did not marry, did not take a new post, though he was offered command more than once, of garrisons, of expeditions, honors any other man in his position would have seized. He stayed at Castle Rock, in rooms further and further from the center of court life, and the cat stayed with him. And Mirelle, who had grown from a girl running errands into a woman who ran the household's linens and knew every hallway by feel in the dark, began to notice something that unsettled her more than she could explain to anyone who might have listened. The cat did not age.
You tell yourself all manner of things, she said. That cats simply look the same for years longer than you'd think. That you're misremembering the color of her coat when she was young. That time plays tricks on memory the way it plays tricks on everything else. I told myself all of it. But I had scrubbed those same floors for 20 years by then, and I knew, the way you know your own hands, that the cat curled in his lap the night I brought him linens as a girl of 15 was, impossibly, the very same cat curled there when I was a woman past 40. It was around this time that the third warden came. Not on unrelated business this time. Mirelle was certain of that, looking back, though she hadn't understood it then. This one asked sharper questions. Asked about the old apothecary woman 2 villages over, the one Mirelle had visited so many years before, and whether anyone recalled unusual purchases from the castle around the time of the princess's illness. Asked specifically about a sealed jar, wax-stoppered, the kind used to hold things that needed.
Asked specifically about a sealed jar, wax-stoppered, the kind used to hold things that needed to stay untouched by air. I don't know how he knew to ask that, Mirelle said, and her hands, I noticed, had gone very still in her lap. I have wondered since whether the old apothecary woman, near the end of her own life, said something to someone, or whether the wardens simply pull at every thread long enough that some of them eventually lead somewhere. Someone, she said, had found something. A scrap, she never learned exactly what, unearthed during repairs to an old drainage channel below the high tower. Ash that had settled wrong, a stain on stone that shouldn't have been there, some small physical thing that, on its own, meant nothing, and in the hands of a man trained to notice, meant everything. I saw the knight that week, Mirelle said, for the first time in longer than I could count. He came to find me directly, which he had never once done in 20 years of my quiet service to him. He asked me one question, whether I remembered what I'd carried for him all those years before. I asked what she'd told him. The truth,
she said, that I remembered every item and had understood none of it, and had said nothing to anyone, not out of loyalty exactly, but because some silences, once you've kept them long enough, become part of who you are. She met my eyes, finally, fully, for the first time since she'd sat down beside me. He thanked me, and then he told me, very calmly, that I should not come to the high tower that night, for any reason, whatever I heard. Behind us, through the tall windows, I became aware that the faint, pale shapes I had taken for distant wildflowers on the ridge seemed, in the deepening dark, to be moving, though there was no wind I could feel inside the hall to explain it. The smell of smoke, so faint before, had grown just perceptibly stronger, though no fire burned anywhere near us that I could see. And somewhere beneath the strings and the low, patient rhythm of the music, I thought I heard, or imagined I heard, the specific sound of boots on stone, somewhere far above us, deliberate, unhurried, closing. You have to understand, Mirelle said, and her voice, for the first time all evening, was not entirely steady. What the healers actually told him before he vanished. Not a curable illness, not one that answered to medicine or to prayer or to the mountain cures everyone assumed he'd gone chasing. A wasting, slow and certain, the kind the old healers had a dozen gentle names for, and only one true meaning. She was dying, plainly and naturally, of nothing anyone had cursed into her. There was no enemy. There had never been an enemy.
That was the story the court told itself afterward. Because a story needs a villain more than it needs a truth, and a sorcerer's curse is easier to hate than an ordinary, terrible illness that simply arrives and does not leave. The knight had not gone to the mountains for a cure. He had gone searching for something the healers themselves had warned him, in hushed and horrified voices, never to seek. An old binding, older than the crown's laws forbidding it, that could hold a soul inside a living vessel, when the body meant to carry it could no longer manage the weight of staying. Not a cure, a postponement, bought at a price the old texts described only in warning. That was the story the court told itself afterward. Because a story needs a villain more than it needs a truth, and a sorcerer's curse is easier to hate than an ordinary, terrible illness that simply arrives and does not leave. The knight had not gone to the mountains for a cure. He had gone searching for something the healers themselves had warned him, in hushed and horrified voices, never to seek. An old binding, older than the crown's laws forbidding it, that could hold a soul inside a living vessel, when the body meant to carry it could no longer manage the weight of staying. Not a cure, a postponement, bought at a price the old texts described only in warning.
That is what he traded, Mirelle said. Not gold, not rank, not the things the court assumed a hero sacrifices. He traded the rest of his own life as a leash he would carry forever, so that she would not have to end that autumn in that bed the way the healers had promised she must. It worked. That was the horror of it, and the mercy, tangled together in a way Mirelle said she had never managed to fully separate all these years later. It worked, but not as he had hoped. Not as any version of himself standing in that sick room weeks before could have imagined it working. Elowyn's soul did not return to her own failing body. It settled instead into the nearest living thing, close enough and willing enough to hold it. The small white cat that had wandered the castle grounds for years, half tame, no one's in particular, until that night it became, in every way that mattered, someone's entirely. She lived, Mirelle said. That is the truth beneath everything I have told you tonight. She did not die that autumn. She lives still, so far as I know, curled in his lap on nights no one else is permitted to witness, answering only to a name only he still says aloud. But she can never again be who she was, and he can never again be free of what he did to keep her. The tower fire, Mirelle said, had never been vengeance. Not against a sorcerer who never existed, not against fate, not against grief itself, though grief certainly had been standing beside him the whole time he built it. The warden had found enough that final week to be certain, and certainty in a warden moves quickly toward judgment, and judgment for this particular crime did not distinguish between the caster's death and the bound souls. If the ritual site was found intact, if the proof was laid before the Crown's own investigators, both of them would be unmade together, cleanly, permanently. The small mercy of a slow natural death traded for something far crueler and far more final. He did not burn that tower in fury, Mirelle said. He burned it in the hours he had left before the wardens reached it themselves. Every trace of the ritual, every text, every tool, everything that could prove what he had done or teach another desperate soul to attempt the same. He meant to burn only the high chamber. The old stone held the fire longer than he judged it would. It spread before he could stop it, down through the halls, into the wings below, and by the time it was done, half the castle he had grown up serving stood in ash around him. She was quiet a long moment, and I found I had nothing to fill the silence with, and did not want to. He was not punished for the fire, she said eventually. How could the Crown punish a man for a blaze that, so far as any record shows, an unknown enemy set the very same week a warden's inquiry mysteriously went cold? The court rebuilt. The court forgot, or chose to, the way courts do. On the story that made the most sense to tell their own children. A sorcerer, a curse, a grieving hero who burned down evil rather than let it stand. And the truth, I said, finally, quietly, is that there was no sorcerer at all. No, Mirelle said. There was only ever a man who loved someone enough to trade away his own peace forever to keep her from ending. And a servant girl who carried what was asked and never once thought to ask why. The music had softened by the time she finished. Not stopped, only settled, the way a room settles when it senses, without quite knowing why, that something important has just passed through it. I did not ask Mirelle anything more. Some stories close a door gently behind them when they end, and you learn, traveling as long as I have, not to knock on doors that have chosen to close. I left before the ball itself ended, which is not my custom, but the tower on the ridge had pulled at something in me all night, the way certain places do once you know what they hold, and I found myself walking the hill path in the last dark before dawn instead of my bed. The field around the old ruin was thick with wildflowers, more than I had realized from the ballroom windows, pale petals catching what little moonlight made it through the smoke-grey clouds, though I told myself the smoke was only my imagination, or the last of the hearth fires from the castle behind me. Nothing more. And there, beneath a tree old enough to have watched the fire itself happen, I saw him. An old knight, seated against the trunk the way a man sits when he has stopped expecting to need to rise quickly for anything ever again. Armor still on him, though dulled now with years. Gauntlet resting gently on the back of a small white cat curled in his lap, her eyes catching the faint light, her whole body rising and falling with the slow.
it.